I don't know if you listened to that, Simon, but the intro music there was a little bit different. It was actually a bird singing. It was a great tit, and unlike the BBC, we got the right bird.
Of course we did. Okay, so hello and welcome to another episode of Science of the Times. So Tim, while I've been working hard, teaching, running around, writing reports, it turns out you've been doing something quite different.
Teaching and writing reports? You mean watching Liverpool lose?
I can't believe you got that in.
I've been away. I've been at a conference in South Africa. It's called the Savannah Networking Conference, and it's an amazing place, good conference, an amazing location. It's a place called Skakuza in Kruger National Park, and I even managed to fit in a game of golf at the world's wildest golf course. And amazing. I am to golf what hippos are to mountaineering. Utterly hopeless. But one of the things we saw it's an amazing place for bird life, Kruger National Park. They've got about over 500 species of birds.
Oh, goodness.
And I think Sonia probably saw nearly all of them.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. Did you get some good photos?
Sonia got a lot of out of focus photos, but I got some amazing ones. Yeah, thank you.
That's harsh. You might tell things differently, I guess. It's interesting you talk about birds. So that's actually the topic of our podcast today.
I know. So one of our British birds, our common British birds, the great tit, it turns out, they're found across Europe and very widespread. And it turns out they have cultural differences.
Yeah, so just like we have cultural differences in humans, it turns out that it's actually widespread throughout the animal kingdom too, and in birds.
No, that's right. I mean, it's really impressive. And so we're going to talk to some people today who have been studying the great tits. In fact, this great tit study has been going on since 1947 in Oxford, in Wytham Woods. It's one of the world's longest studies of an animal in the world. And we'll talk to Ben Sheldon, who's running it at the moment. And his collaborator, Nilo, who's been looking at birdsong.
Wonderful. Can't wait to have them on. And obviously both of us know Ben and you know both of them. So it'll be, really looking forward to it. But Tim, perhaps I don't need to say this, but something tells me I do. Just keep the puns till after we finish recording. What,
you're worried I'm going to make a tit of myself?
I think I know you are. Can't believe you said it. Okay, Tim, so time to have our guests on. So really delighted to have Nilo and Ben, and I'll let them introduce themselves. So Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Ben Sheldon, so I'm Professor of Ornithology here in the University of Oxford.
And I'm Nilo, and I'm a postdoc also here at the University of Oxford, working in Ben's lab.
And you've brought your dog Tabor along, which is nice.
Yes.
So Ben, you've been leading a long-term study of great tits.
Yeah. So this is a study of birds, great tits, which are common woodland birds. But actually you can find them in gardens as well. So it's a really common, widely distributed bird, and they breed in holes in trees naturally. But actually, if you put up artificial nest boxes, then they love going into those, and that means they're really easy to study. And that was why they were picked as a species to study back in the 40s, when a guy called David Lack was looking for a study system when he moved to Oxford to set up the Edward Grey Institute, which is an ornithology research institute here in Oxford.
And so the study takes place largely in Wytham Woods or exclusively?
Yeah, so our study is based on Wytham Woods, which is just to the west of Oxford. So it's a hill covered in forest. It's about 400 hectares, 4 square kilometres, if that means anything to you. Deciduous woodland, and so it is fully sort of covered with nest boxes. So we've got about 1,200 nest boxes up around the woods there, and every year we collect sort of very standard data about which boxes are occupied, by what species, what they do, and so on.
Okay, and so what kind of things are you looking for in this study? What are you hoping to get out?
Well, it can be used for lots and lots of things. I guess one of the things is because it's been running for quite a long time and collecting data in a very standard way, then it's a very powerful tool to look at how changes have happened in populations, classically, for example, in response to climate change. So this has been one of the systems where we've been able to see signals of climate change in the way the populations behaved.
So tell us a little bit about how you collect the data.
Well, it's good old-fashioned kind of field ecological data collection. So teams of students and postdocs and field assistants in my group go out, particularly starting in around this time of year, so late March, go out and they each have a sort of, a round of nest boxes, which they're responsible for. And every week or so, they go and check those boxes, find out which ones are occupied. And then once we know which ones are occupied, we then have a standard way of collecting the data, which basically what we try and do is minimize the number of times we need to visit each box to collect a bunch of different types of data, which are part of our long-term population study.
Is the reason for minimizing so you don't disturb the birds?
That's partly that, but it's also partly to save field assistance, because actually, one round might be 20 kilometers to get round. So actually, minimizing the number of times you need to kind of visit each box is definitely a consideration there as well. But it's also, of course, the effects on birds. We want to do as little as possible to disturb these birds, so that in a sense what they're doing is as natural as possible. Yeah.
And you mark the birds, don't you?
Yes. So we what we do is we fit what I call these little sort of metal rings, they're called, which have an individual number on them. And that's the sort of traditional way of marking and identifying birds in populations like this. About 15 years ago, we started also using little electronic, they're what are called RFID tags. So it's like, if you go to a shop and expensive items are tagged with these kinds of things. And this enables us to identify the birds without having to catch them, which is actually kind of quite useful for some kinds of studies. So that's the thing we introduced. This actually helps us to do even less disturbance than we did, because with a little antenna around a nest box, you can work out which bird there is without even having to catch it and read its ring number. So,
and you ring them as young?
So we ring the young birds in the nest, and then that's really useful because we know exactly when they were born, where they were born, and then we can track them all the way through their lives, potentially. And we also catch the parent birds, or actually identify them without catching them these days. And then we can link together parents and offspring and so on. So.
And couldn't you have found a more interesting species to study, like wolves or guppies?
Yeah, well, that's I'm often asked that. Actually, when I was a student, I spent 2 summers, one in Madagascar and one in Borneo, so studying tropical biology, and it was amazing. But then I went and did PhDs and all my sort of subsequent research on fairly common sort of birds that you could find locally. So, I guess I sort of actually found that the scientific appeal of those systems is that they are accessible and you don't have to travel massive distances. And often there are lots of previous studies, so you actually got a lot of background knowledge to kind of put there. So I suppose I'm less of a sort of discoverer or explorer compared to some people. Obviously it's great, that kind of science as well, but it never really appealed to me in the same way as studying something where you can already say a lot about what's known. So yeah.
So something you've said, I think I just haven't thought about before. So is it fair to say that any great tit that visits Whiteham Wood you would know about or know something about?
I don't think we can't quite claim that every single bird that sort of enters the wood we know about. But I think what we hope is that certainly the vast majority of birds born there we will have ringed as nestlings, so we can, in principle, track them throughout their lives if we catch them again. We put quite a lot of effort into catching birds that have come into the woodland, so it's not a closed system. So there's lots of woodlands around, and great tits move between woodlands, and so we put effort into catching them in the winter, sort of before they've settled down as breeding birds. So as early as possible, we get to know about these birds and their presence in the population. But it's a large enough place that you can't sort of track every single bird in it all the time.
Sure,
you have to rely on these kinds of methods.
But the vast majority of birds you see up there, great tits, have got a band on them.
They, yes, I'm going to have to correct your terminology there, Tim.
Ring, sorry,
so, yes,
married to an Australian.
Slipped into,
band.
yes. So in the UK we say ring. In America or Australia or other places they talk about bands.
Right.
But, it's one of those.
I stand corrected. But actually, that was a cunning segue, because these birds don't just occur in the UK; they're found across Europe, aren't they? And other people study them in a very similar manner. I think the Oxford study was the first.
Yeah, well, actually, the first study was actually in the Netherlands, but that study is no longer running. So actually, the idea for that study came when David Lack come to Oxford. He was over in the Netherlands, partly trying to actually persuade Nico Tinbergen to move to Oxford. Nico Tinbergen, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize for ethology. And while there, he met some Dutch ornithologists who had started sort of long-term population studies of great tits. And I think the idea, realizing that this was a really great model species, came from those conversations. Our study is the longest continuously running one. That's what we can still claim. But the first one was it's actually the Dutch who had the smart idea. And there you go.
And how many birds have been ringed now in Whiteham?
Well, great tits, it depends a little bit how you define Whiteham, but well over 120,000 individuals that we can talk about. So, yeah.
And then you've just had a paper come out, and Nilo, you were the first author on this in Current Biology. So very many congratulations on that. Great journal. So do you want us to give us a quick summary, or give the audience a quick summary of what the paper's about?
Yeah, sure. So as part of these long-term study that Ben was just describing, we wanted to, on top of all of those existing data for individual birds, build an extra layer of information. So these birds, the males specifically, the females also sing a little bit, but we know less about that. The males sing, fairly small repertoires, especially during the breeding season, that they use to potentially defend their territories and also to attract females. And these songs are, an important part of their lives, and also have a kind of a cultural element to them because they're learned. They need to learn them from one another. The birds kind of have this innate ability to learn songs, but the precise content of those songs is something that varies with learning exposure, with the exposure to tutors, we might call them, that they encounter while they're learning, right? So, as I was trying to say, we have all this information for individuals. If you then build this extra layer on top where you have songs that you can match with individuals, that might allow you to say interesting things about how the songs change over time and how they respond to all the population processes that we already know of, that we think are really important for other aspects of the bird's biology. So these are things like how the birds move around while they're trying to find the territory, the age distribution of those birds, the relative proportion of the area of the population that is composed of older versus younger birds, for example. So like I said, these different processes we think are important, and there's a lot of theory that says this should be important, and it's very important in other aspects of biology, but we don't have a lot of kind of empirical evidence of how this works at really small scales within populations.
All great tits learn their song, do they?
Yeah, so we think that they have some innate tendencies and biases and kind of perceptual and cognitive nature to learn some things rather than others. But exactly what they learn specifically depends partly on what they're exposed to. So it's a bit of a cultural process.
If they only heard chiff-chaff singing, would a great tit end up singing like a chiff-chaff?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of those kind of natural experiments that you could exploit to understand that in great tits, but they do seem to at least partially mimic or learn the songs of other birds. So people commonly tell you that if you hear a bird and you're not quite sure what it is, it might be a great tit, because even though they sing simple songs in general, these kind of teacher songs that everyone knows, they also have some pretty bizarre songs in the repertoire sometimes.
But each bird doesn't have a single song. It has almost like a pop star with an album.
Yeah, we call it a repertoire of songs.
So that's what you mean by repertoire. They have a whole.
Yeah, exactly.
And how many songs would be in a repertoire typically for a great tit?
In the population that we've studied, and the way we categorize songs, it usually ranges from anywhere from 2 to a dozen different songs.
So Simon, I've been trying to learn the song of the great tit.
All right, Tim, here we go. This is your big chance. Yeah? You want to make a titter yourself?
Okay,
you ready? Right, let's do it.
That's very good.
Thank you. It's been a lot of practice doing that.
You make a very good tit, Tim.
When the couple of octaves higher than anyone has.
Yeah. And then so you go around, you've been going around the woods and you've been recording the same great tit over a few months and a few years, but you've been doing that with lots and lots of different male great tits. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. So I did this over the course of 3 years during my PhD. And what's really good about this population is that even if we didn't have a really long-term data set in terms of the songs, because we only collect them for 3 years, which in relative terms is not that much, there is quite a lot of heterogeneity over space in the composition of those arbitrarily defined neighborhoods, right? So in some areas you have birds that have come from further afield to get to where they ended up breeding. Some areas have a higher proportion of older birds. Others have more birds that came from outside of the population. And this means that you can then test ideas about how this variation in population composition might lead to differences in their exposure to different tutors, and therefore in the songs that they end up singing when their repertoire crystallizes, as we call it.
So how many songs did you analyze in this? How many recordings did you analyze in this?
Yeah, so quite a few. If you want to say anything about these processes, you need big data sets. We ended up collecting slightly over 100,000 different songs.
Wow.
So I think that was 21,000 hours of recordings.
Yeah, something like that.
Which is actually nearly 2.5 years of continuous sound, right? So,
So how on earth do you analyze that amount? So you were going to ask the same question.
Yeah,
weren't
it's
you?
just fascinating. That how do you not just the large data set, but actually the sound itself.
So these led to something that I guess lots of people doing research now experience, which is you start working on a question, then you soon realize that most of your time is going to be spent learning the methods that you need to answer that question. So when I started my PhD with Ben, reading the literature, I thought, well, the methods are there. I'll just use existing methods. And I didn't have to invent anything completely new, but I did have to I spent a good 2 years, learning how to program and deep learning, these kinds of things that you need to be able to analyze these songs. So what we did is manually annotated part of the data set. We trained some models that then allowed us to compare those songs between them. And that then allows you to say things about differences between individuals.
So I'm going to ask a novice's question.
No, I was going to... Go for it.
So if we're just sort of thinking back to what you've said, so you manually annotate the recordings, so you add labels to them,
yes,
and then you use some kind of artificial intelligence approach to sort of learn from what you have and then categorize
that is correct.
to those labels. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is perfectly correct.
And then, so you're basically turning in the song into some music or a pattern, and then you can
a picture actually,
or a picture.
Yeah,
okay.
this is based on visual kind of the same techniques that is used to recognize images, right? So Nilo can say much more about that, but it's
So the same kind of thing that in a phone would, for example, say this is a face because it recognizes that these must be two eyes because of different colored patches, and this must be a nose. That same sort of technique is used to compare.
Yeah, exactly. So in very broad terms, what we did is we labeled songs that we knew came from the same place and in the same year, and we can safely assume in most cases that those came from the same individual. And then that allowed us to train a model to try to distinguish between these different song types within the same year. And then, even though that already doesn't explicitly include information about individuals, because they have these repertoires, overall it means that the model is trying to learn differences, and the things that are most similar end up closer together in this kind of model space, right? And then that allows you to measure differences between the different songs.
So what did you find out then? What's the most exciting thing that you found out?
Yeah, so there's nothing very surprising, which is the kind of question that these days people will ask you, is were you surprised about anything? There's nothing very surprising. In a sense, it's the opposite. We, again, have every reason to think that these population processes will influence song learning. And we find that is indeed the case, and that we can detect it at fairly small scales. And I think that's what's exciting about it. That it allows you to say something, or that to see that there's a correlation between these population processes and what they end up singing. This means that the songs of the birds encode some information about who is singing them, and that's something that we already knew in terms of things like, their size and how energetic they are. But it also encodes information about the population as a whole and their movements and what's going to happen to them, their life histories.
So do you think you could go backwards? Sorry, Ben, you were about to say something.
No, I was going to say I think Nilo's being characteristically kind of
Modest
about the work, because I think one of the important things here is that, in a sense, what we have here is a clear expectation that these, what we could call demographic processes, things like how far individuals have moved, how much they mix, how long they've been in one place, should leave a strong signal in the local acoustic landscape. But actually testing whether that's true hasn't been done. So what we found is actually that the patterns very much conform to that expectation, which I think is a sign that actually, our sort of theory about how song type variation is, occurred and distributed is sort of correct. So it's very nice. It confirms a theory, and I think Nilo's feeling that's not very exciting, but actually I think in some sense it is exciting because it tells us that the way we understand the world, we can understand a lot from these simple descriptions of how individuals have moved and how far they've come and how long they've lived in one place. And so I think in some sense that is quite an exciting thing to be able to say that, if you go out into the woods this spring, that what you're hearing, why you're hearing a sort of certain pattern of songs here versus over there is, can be explained if you know about the movements of the individuals that are sitting there. And so I find that sort of exciting, but not surprising, I suppose, is the word. But yeah.
I always sort of wonder about the predictive power of things. So I was wondering if you could, for example, know something about a bird and its movements, and then sort of predict what kind of repertoire it should have according to your models.
Well, we couldn't yet, right, Nilo? No.
No, so I mean, these are still kind of statistical descriptions where they're more likely to have, say, bigger repertoires or not, or but in terms of saying exactly what it is that they'll be singing, we're not quite there yet, and there might be intrinsic uncertainty to the process that might not allow you to precisely predict what they end up singing.
I should give you an example of actually this was I suppose perhaps an unexpected finding, which is that as I said, the population, you've got the birds that are born locally and then other birds move in from outside. And when we compared the types of songs sung by the birds that come in from outside versus those birds that are born locally, so you might naively think, well, they're going to bring in somehow sort of different songs than the other ones. But actually what we found is that the birds that come in from outside tend to sing the songs that are commoner in the white population, right? And actually, Nilo was able to do some modelling to show that one way you could explain that is basically that birds coming from outside have moved further. So if you sort of think about the way that they're encountering songs as they move, the further you move, the more songs you encounter, but the more likely you are to have encountered the commoner songs, right? So if you have some sort of, I mean, correct me if I get your model wrong, but if you have a limited capacity to learn songs, then that will sort of effectively fill up with the commoner ones rather than the rarer ones. So that was an unexpected one, but actually something that tells us something quite important about when these songs are learnt. It tells us that it's happening sort of after the birds leave their natal site and as they're moving around and settling down. So I guess that was an example of an interesting and unexpected finding, which took a bit of thinking about, and then a sort of model that kind of confirmed that. So was that a fair description of your...
Yeah, no, I think so, yeah. The one kind of key detail there is that for that to be the case, you need, and this is slightly technical, but you need at least moderately positively frequency-dependent learning. So the... they need to be more likely to learn songs that are more common in the population in a kind of disproportionate way. That happens to be the way lots of birds learn the songs, though, and lots of things are acquired. And we think that holds true for this population.
So taking a step back, why do birds sing? What are they? I mean, it's a beautiful sound. The dawn chorus in particular is fantastic. Well, there are some birds. When you're being woken up at 4 a.m. by a bloody crow outside your window, it's not much fun. But why are the birds singing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are two classic explanations. One is about, particularly this time of year, the reason a lot of males are singing is they're partly signalling to females if they haven't got a mate, to attract a mate. Actually, most great tits by now will already have been paired up since sometime in the winter. So the other function of the signal is to other males to say effectively, this is my area, keep out. I mean, I have to say that's a very sort of traditional interpretation of song. There are lots of things happening which don't fit into that. So, and one of those which is neglected is the fact that actually quite a lot of female birds sing as well. And so clearly it can't just be about males signaling to other males or to females. There must be some other function. So there's probably a lot of complex kind of aspects of communication. And that would also ignore the possibility of sort of birds singing as signals to other species as well, which there could be a degree of interspecific signaling. So yeah.
And they kind of separate out in terms of frequencies, don't they? Many bird species, so that they're not singing over one another. Is that, or did I make that up?
Well, yeah.
That's there is literature in that. It would make for a longer conversation in terms of the acoustic niche partitioning. It's debated. It also happens to be the case that song frequency is highly correlated with how big the birds are. So if you have, some sort of niche partitioning for other ecological reasons, you're also going to get, as a byproduct, differences in song.
It's a great hypothesis, but one which is actually harder to test than the other thing. But what I would say about song frequency, and this is a thing which there is pretty sort of convincing evidence for, is that there's a degree of what we call plasticity in the frequency, so that birds can adjust the frequency at which they sing. And a very sort of replicated finding is that birds singing in urban environments tend to sing at higher frequencies than birds singing in non-urban environments. And that's the explanation given for that, is that urban environments have a lot of low frequency background sound.
Like traffic.
Yeah. So that would be sort of consistent with the fact that you're singing in relation to what's available in the background. But this idea that birds themselves are partitioning is a bit more controversial.
So do you think your findings about great tits can be generalized across birds? Or do you think it's specific to great tits?
The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is there's something about these processes and the fact that these songs are learned that means that some of the processes are common to any learned trait, and by that we mean anything that individuals need to acquire from other individuals during their life, that is not kind of inheritable in a genetic sense. Exactly how these processes shape the songs of a species depends on the biology of the species, and there's a really important element here that we haven't discussed yet, which has to do with when exactly they learn the songs. So some birds are what's called critical period learners, which means that there's a window during which they need to learn. Otherwise, they're not able to have this kind of full adult song. It's to some extent, again, debated, but human language is a bit like that. When you first acquire a language, it's quite early. If you don't do it early enough, then it becomes more difficult. So some birds learn throughout their lives, and they can continue to acquire songs. These are typically birds with large repertoires, where having a large repertoire plays an important role in sexual selection, for example. But some birds, like the great tits, only learn through for a set period in their lives, right?
And when is that period? Are they still in the nest, or?
Yeah, we think that in great tits this extends to the time when they breed for the first time. So especially the first kind of autumn and winter up until the early spring.
There are some beautiful examples of somewhat, as Nilo mentioned, some species sing very large repertoires, and the marsh warbler is a great example of this. A very nondescript looking brown bird, but these are birds that migrate to Africa for the winter. And actually, if you're a really skilled bird watcher, if you know African birds, you can have a marsh warbler singing in Europe that is singing the songs of maybe dozens of African species. So you can actually pinpoint sort of where it's been in Africa from, if you know enough about the distribution of the birds there. And that's phenomenal. They carry this kind of cultural information from Africa back to the UK, and then sing these songs. They weave them into their kind of their songs, which they're singing in some damp meadow somewhere in Europe. So that's pretty amazing, I think, actually.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And then, so if you were to go over to, say, the Netherlands or somewhere like that, and you were to listen to a great tit singing, it's still clearly a great tit, is it? I mean, they haven't because you could imagine that the songs differ quite significantly in different places.
Yeah, so for some species, kind of local regional dialects, as we might call them, arise quite easily. So if you have, especially species with small repertoires that only learn for a bit and they don't move, then you might expect kind of sort of geographical clustering. In the case of great tits, we know that they tend to disperse over let's say 600, 800, around a kilometer, depends where exactly you're in the world. But that, coupled with the fact that there's a lot of them, means that the population is mixes constantly. If you pair that with the fact that the repertoires are a bit bigger, it means that there are no clear boundaries to their kind of songs, and there are no clear differences like that. There's more of a continuous landscape of variation across Europe, for example.
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting that Northern European great tits are partially migratory. So actually, we will get some great tits here in the winter that are birds from Scandinavia or Northwestern Europe. So, and if that's the period during which they're learning their song, then in principle, sort of British songs can also be taken back to the to other parts of Europe. It doesn't work in reverse. So our birds never go long distances. So ours are very sedentary. So
well, why wouldn't you? If you lived in Whiting Woods, what a wonderful part
why
of
would
the
you leave
world.
Oxford?
So what will be a natural extension now of the current work in the paper that that we just discussed? Do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's two different directions in which you could take it. One is we only recorded 3 years, and even though we were able to say quite a bit about cultural diversity, how many different songs you had in different areas and how these varied, how much kind of change and turnover of songs there was. If in 10 years or so you recorded songs again, that would allow you to say a lot more about longer term changes and the kinds of processes that constrain that variation. So over time, great tits still sound like great tits. It's not that there is this kind of open-endedness, is the kind of divergence that happens. They're always constrained in what they can learn. Within that space, there is variation, but the space is one that you could characterize by recording birds over a longer time. Yeah. Also, as part of the research, kind of something that necessitated by the methods, we found that it was quite easy, given the right methods, to distinguish individual birds based on their song. So you can train models to that can tell the individuals apart, and this is without even having to catch them to put a ring on them. And this means that it's potentially things that you can do when it comes to monitoring them and understanding how they learn the songs that you can do without even having to catch them.
So going back to the artificial intelligence and the machine learning bit, there's an app you can get for your phone called Merlin, and I think that match it listens. It's a bit like Shazam, isn't it? It listens out to bird songs, and it tells you what bird it is. How does that do on things like marsh tits if they're flown back from Africa and
marsh warblers?
Marsh warblers.
Tits on the brain, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, marsh warblers. I mean, I think it's. So I actually Nilo could say more about the sort of the underlying algorithms that drive that kind of software. I mean, it's pretty good actually, provided it knows sort of where you are. It uses location very much to kind of constrain things. And if you forget to switch that on when you run Merlin on your phone, you suddenly find you're hearing all kinds of really rare birds. I mean, occasionally get things wrong. So I use it. I'm very fond of it and like introducing it to people. But occasionally it's made some sort of great, clear mistakes. And my favourite one was actually, so where I walk the dog every morning is near the pitch where the Oxford women's lacrosse team practice, and it did once identify them as a flock of pink-footed geese. So occasionally we'll get stuff very wrong, but it's actually pretty impressive if you think about it, because it's unlike Shazam, which was basically recognizing an identical track each time. It has to generalize from the properties, right? So there's a sort of more sophisticated thing going on. The fact that you can do that on your phone is kind of pretty cool, actually.
And I also believe that Merlin once picked up a bird singing that you didn't hear and didn't see, but you didn't write it down on your list, did you?
Well, yeah. I mean, like many people, Tim, as I've got older, my ability to hear high frequency sounds has started to diminish, and it's quite selective actually. And there is a fairly rare bird in this part of England called the tree pipit, which has a very characteristic call, high pitched call. They make as they fly over in migration. So I'd never seen or heard one in Oxfordshire, and I switched on Merlin one day, and it immediately said, "Oh, there's a tree pipit," and and it's the recording is very clear. It clearly was one, but it's just at a frequency that I can't hear any longer. So, it
doesn't count.
It creates a dilemma. What do you do if your phone is kind of you were holding your phone and it said there was a thing there, but you couldn't hear it? So,
So Ben should explain what this list is, I guess, for our listeners.
Yeah, you have a list. Do you do this as well, Nilo?
I do not. I'm not a real bird.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, like many birders keep lists of different things, and it's a sort of fairly harmless thing. And I've enjoyed often, doing that on a sort of local scale, so trying to see as many birds as I can within the city of Oxford in a year, for example. And Oxford's actually got lots of birds. So
I should add that this is actually an important part of kind of the driving force behind some of the science that we can do now. So people like Ben will make these lists, and then researchers can use these lists to try to understand, who's around and how population dynamics take place, and migratory kind of movements, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we are actually trying to combine the sort of the machine learning side of the acoustic identification with trying to estimate population density of species in white at the moment, so more generally than great tits, but kind of trying to get sort of estimates from using that method, which is actually sort of much more kind of systematic and wider coverage way than you could do just by one person wandering around. So
it's great to hear how kind of these new computer tools, machine learning, artificial intelligence are kind of feeding into, so to allow us to discover more stuff about the natural world. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about these sorts of things. But congratulations on a really fantastic paper. But before we finish, Simon, you've been very good. I know you've been smirking about the use of great tits throughout, but I think Ben has got one or two cleanish anecdotes. We are described as a clean podcast.
Yeah.
We're very family friendly.
We are, aren't you?
I mean, it's obviously when you study a thing, you become unaware of the kind of the possibility for kind of misunderstanding or whatever. And I did have it was a few years ago now, but I sent, so some journals, if you want to send a paper there, you send what's called a pre-submission inquiry to see, are you interested in this paper? And hopefully they say yes, and then you can send it along and so on. So I did that once to a journal which will remain nameless. And I sent my nicely crafted inquiry off, and I waited a few days, and I didn't get a response. I thought it's a bit funny. They're usually quite quick. So I sent it again, and I didn't get a response. I think I sent it a third time, didn't get a response. I started to get slightly annoyed by this, sort of, could at least acknowledge this. So I wrote an email just without the title of the paper, any details, to the editor, and he said, "Oh, I never received it." I was like, "Well, I know I sent it." And I thought, well, actually, is there a problem here that I used the common name for this bird?
Yes.
And some spam filters will automatically filter that out. So actually, I tried an experiment, and I used the Latin name rather than the common name, and then it sailed through, and he got it. So so this is an example of a sort of inadvertent kind of block on. So, but having worked on these birds for 25 years, I mean, in a sense, I sort of forget that it might seem a bit kind of funny. I mean, of course, tit in Old English actually just means small bird. So,
sure, yeah.
So it didn't have the kind of, I suppose, the jokey kind of interpretation.
If you have a juvenile humour like Tim's, I guess, then it keeps you
well,
laughing. Well,
I imagine that Rich has edited out all of your bad jokes there, Simon. Look, thanks very much for coming along. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on the paper again.
Absolutely.
We'll put a link to the paper below.
It's open access, so anyone can read it.
Yeah, and I recommend reading it. And
in fact, the data is open access as well. So if you want to go and analyse Nilo's hard-won data, it's all there.
No,
wonderful.
That's fantastic. And that's one of the great things about open access science, is that people can go and see what you've done and play with the data and write and ask you questions. But also subscribe. Remember, subscribe to our podcast.
Yeah, please do subscribe, folks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I'll see you next week, Simon.
Yep. See you next week, Tim.
Yeah.
Bye. Pleasure.
Okay. Thank you.